Before we begin, I need you to understand something. This isn't a story about a plant. It isn't merely a chronicle of drug lords or smugglers or the shifting tides of addiction. This is a story about the precise moment the world broke open. It is a story about how the insatiable hunger for tea and silk on one side of the ocean and the desperate need for silver on the other conspired to shatter the oldest empire on earth. It is a narrative of how a single commodity, a sticky, dark resin harvested from a fragile flower, became the battering ram that forced the doors of the East wide open to the West. The events we are about to explore did not just change the map of the world, they rewrote the psychological DNA of nations, destroyed millions of lives, and set in motion a cycle of humiliation and resentment that defines global geopolitics to this very day. The smoke from these fires has never truly cleared. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel as it helps us continue to uncover these forgotten archives. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, put your phone away. Silence the distractions of the modern world. Let the noise fade. Let's begin. In the beginning, long before the gunboats steamed up the Pearl River, there was only the earth and the flower. Our story begins not in the bustle of 19th century trade, but in the silence of the Neolithic Age. Deep in the cradle of civilization, among the fertile soils of Mesopotamia, the Sumerians cultivated a delicate plant they called hulgil, or the joy plant. Imagine the landscape of the ancient world. The sun beating down on the clay brick walls of Uruk, the wind rustling through fields of Papaver somniferum. For millennia, this plant was not a scourge, but a sacrament. The Egyptians saw it as a gift from the gods to soothe a crying child or to ease the passage of the dying into the afterlife. The Greeks dedicated it to Nyx, the goddess of night, and Hypnos, the god of sleep. It was a medicine, a painkiller, a bridge between the waking world and the realm of dreams. The first chapter of this story takes us to the Silk Road. As the centuries ground forward, the resin of the poppy traveled. It moved in the saddlebags of Arab traders, crossing the harsh deserts of Central Asia, winding through the mountain passes of the Hindu Kush, and finally arriving in the Middle Kingdom. By the time of the Tang dynasty in China, opium was known, but it was rare. A luxury, a medicine used by monks to aid meditation or by doctors to treat dysentery. It was consumed as a drink, a bitter tea that brought a heavy, warm relaxation to the limbs. It was harmless, or so it seemed. The world was vast then, separated by oceans that took months to cross. China sat at the center of its own universe, the Zhongguo, the Middle Kingdom. To the emperors of the Qing dynasty, who ruled from the forbidden depths of Beijing, the outside world was populated by barbarians. The Europeans, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and eventually the British, were viewed as uncouth merchants, begging for the privilege of trading for Chinese silks, porcelains, and, most importantly, tea. By the mid-18th century, a system had been established. It was known as the Canton system. Picture the humid, bustling port of Canton, now Guangzhou. This was the only window the Dragon Empire left open to the west. Foreign traders were confined to a small district known as the 13 Factories. These were not factories in the modern sense. but trading posts, warehouses, and living quarters, all squeezed onto a thin strip of land along the riverbank. The air here was thick with humidity and the smell of spices, tar, and unwashed bodies. The river was choked with sampans and junks, their wooden hulls bumping against the majestic, towering East Indiaman ships of the British. It was a place of immense wealth and immense restriction. The Europeans were forbidden to learn Chinese. They were forbidden to bring their wives or weapons. They were forbidden to enter the city walls of Canton. They existed on the sufferance of the emperor, overseen by the Habo, the imperial customs administrator, and the Hong merchants, a monopoly of Chinese businessmen who acted as the buffer between the imperial court and the red-haired barbarians. But then, something changed. The world would never be the same after the British developed a thirst that they could not quench. By the late 1700s, Britain was drinking tea. It was a national obsession. From the slums of London to the drawing rooms of the aristocracy, everyone demanded the brewed leaves of the Camellia sinensis. And China was the only supplier. The British East India Company, perhaps the most powerful corporation in human history, faced a catastrophic economic problem. The Chinese did not want British goods. They had no need for wool in a humid climate. They had no interest in British clocks or scientific instruments. As the Qianlong Emperor famously wrote to King George III, "Our celestial empire possesses all things in prolific abundance. We have no need of the manufactures of outside barbarians." The Chinese demanded payment in only one thing: silver, Spanish silver dollars. For decades, the silver flowed one way. It was a hemorrhage of wealth from the west to the east. Britain was draining its treasury to pay for its tea habit. The trade imbalance was unsustainable. The East India Company was on the brink of bankruptcy. They needed a commodity that the Chinese desired, something that could be traded for tea, something that would keep the silver in British vaults. They found it in the fertile plains of Bengal in India. The second chapter reveals the transformation of a medicine into a weapon. The East India Company, having colonized large swaths of India, industrialized the production of opium. This was no longer the small-scale cultivation of the ancients. This was the factory system. Imagine the vast fields of white poppies stretching to the horizon under the hot Indian sun. Thousands of laborers would move through the rows, scoring the seed pods with sharp blades. The milky white latex would ooze out, drying overnight into a dark, sticky gum. This gum was scraped off, collected in vats, and processed into balls the size of cannonballs, wrapped in poppy petals and packed into chests made of mango wood. The British knew this trade was illegal in China. The Yongzheng Emperor had prohibited the smoking of opium as early as 1729. But the profits were too high to ignore. The East India Company developed a system of plausible deniability. They would sell the opium at auction in Calcutta to private traders, country traders, who would then sail the dangerous waters to the Chinese coast. The mechanics of this smuggling operation were a marvel of naval architecture and human greed. The traders used a new kind of ship, the opium clipper. These were sleek, narrow-hulled vessels, built for speed, designed to slice through the waves and outrun the cumbersome Chinese junks. Ships with names like the Sylph, the Red Rover, and the Water Witch raced across the Bay of Bengal, their holds packed with the black mud. When they arrived in the Pearl River Delta, they did not dock at Canton. They anchored at Linton Island, a lawless outpost in the estuary. Their floating warehouses, known as receiving ships, stored the opium. Under the cover of darkness, or sometimes in broad daylight with the help of bribed officials, small, fast boats called scrambling dragons and fast crabs would ferry the drug up the river networks to the eager distributors. The impact was immediate and devastating. In the year 1800, perhaps 4,000 chests of opium entered China. By 1838, that number had exploded to 40,000 chests per year. The balance of trade flipped. Suddenly, the silver was flowing out of China. The economy began to destabilize. The price of silver rose, impoverishing the peasantry who paid their taxes in copper but were assessed in silver. But the economic ruin was secondary to the human cost. The smoke of the opium pipe began to drift through every layer of Chinese society. It started with the wealthy young men of the scholar gentry class, bored and affluent. But it trickled down. It reached the soldiers of the Green Standard Army. It reached the palace eunuchs. It reached the coolies working the docks. While the British Parliament debated the morality of the trade, with many arguing that if they didn't sell it, the Americans or Portuguese would. The coastal provinces of China were sinking into a stupor. Moving into the late 1830s, the crisis reached the Dragon Throne. The Daoguang Emperor was a man of austere habits, deeply concerned with the rotting of his empire from within. He convened a series of debates among his top officials. Some argued for legalization and taxation, admitting that the ban was unenforceable. But the moralists, the hardliners, argued for total eradication. The debate was won by a man named Lin Zexu. Lin Zexu is a figure of towering importance in this story. He was a scholar official of immense integrity, known as Blue Sky Lin for his incorruptibility. He believed that opium was a poison introduced by foreign devils to weaken the Chinese race. In 1839, the emperor appointed him as the Imperial Commissioner with plenary powers to stamp out the opium trade in Canton. Lin arrived in Canton in March of 1839. He did not negotiate. He acted. He arrested thousands of Chinese dealers and addicts. He forced addicts to undergo withdrawal, setting up sanitariums. Then he turned his eyes toward the 13 factories. He demanded that the foreign merchants surrender all their opium stores. He locked them in their factories, withdrawing their Chinese servants and cutting off their food and water supplies. The British Superintendent of Trade, Captain Charles Elliot, was forced to capitulate. He ordered the merchants to hand over their stock, promising that the British government would reimburse them. Over 20,000 chests of opium were surrendered. What happened next would shock the world. Lin Zexu did not simply burn the opium. Burning it would release the fumes into the air, potentially intoxicating the locals. Instead, he dug 3 massive trenches on the beach at Human. He filled them with water and salt. He had the opium balls chopped into pieces and thrown into the trenches. Then, laborers added lime, which boiled the water and dissolved the drug. For 23 days, the destruction continued. Lin Zexu stood on the viewing pavilion, watching the dark sludge flow out into the ocean. composing poetry to apologize to the spirits of the sea for polluting their domain. It was a moment of supreme triumph for Chinese sovereignty. But Lin Zexu had a shadow. He did not understand the nature of the enemy he was provoking. He believed the British were dependent on tea and rhubarb to survive. That, without rhubarb, they would die of constipation. He believed their ships were unwieldy and their soldiers, with their tight uniforms and stiff legs, could not fight on land. He was wrong. In London, the news of the seizure and the detention of British subjects caused an uproar. The opium lobby was powerful. They petitioned the government, crying out about the violation of property rights and national honor. The Foreign Secretary, Lord Palmerston, a man of aggressive imperial ambition, saw an opportunity. It was not, he claimed, about protecting the opium trade. It was about teaching China a lesson in the rules of the modern world, worlds of the modern worlds of modern world. And so the First Opium War began. The arrival of the British Expeditionary Force in June 1840 was like an invasion from another planet. The technological gap was centuries wide. The British brought with them the Nemesis, an iron-hulled, steam-powered warship. It was a monster of the Industrial Revolution, capable of navigating shallow rivers impervious to Chinese cannonballs. When the Nemesis engaged the Chinese war junks, it was a slaughter. The British ship could maneuver against the wind. It fired rockets, Congreve rockets, that screamed through the air and set the wooden Chinese ships ablaze. The Chinese sailors fought with desperate bravery, but their matchlock muskets and stationary cannons were useless against the mobile, disciplined firepower of the Royal Navy. The war moved up the coast. The British captured city after city. Jushan, Ningbo, Ding, Ai. The reports sent back to the emperor were filled with lies, as terrified officials could not bear to tell the Son of Heaven that his armies were being decimated by a few thousand barbarians. In 1842, the British ships reached the Yangtze River, cutting off the Grand Canal, the artery that brought grain to Beijing. The empire was strangled. The Daoguang emperor had no choice but to sue for peace. The Treaty of Nanking was signed on the deck of the HMS Cornwallis. It was the first of what the Chinese would call the unequal treaties. China was forced to pay a massive indemnity, 21 million silver dollars, to cover the cost of the war and the destroyed opium. They were forced to open 5 treaty ports to foreign trade, where British subjects would be exempt from Chinese law. And, most painfully, they were forced to cede a small rocky island at the mouth of the Pearl River to the British Crown in perpetuity. That island was Hong Kong. But history is rarely a straight line. The Treaty of Nanking resolved nothing. The British were unsatisfied. They wanted more access, more ports, and the legalization of opium. The Chinese were resentful, dragging their feet on every clause, refusing to allow foreigners into the walled city of Canton. While the diplomats argued, the rot continued. The opium trade, though still technically illegal, flourished more than ever. The corruption deepened. The Qing dynasty was facing internal rebellion. The Taiping Rebellion, a civil war that would claim 20 million lives. And they could not focus entirely on the foreign threat. By the mid-1850s, the tension was nearing a breaking point again. The catalyst was a small ship called the Arrow. It was a Chinese-owned vessel, registered in Hong Kong, flying the British flag. Chinese authorities boarded it, suspecting piracy, and arrested the crew. The British claimed the flag had been insulted. It was a flimsy pretext, but it was enough. The Second Opium War began. This time, the British were joined by the French, who had their own grievances. The conflict that followed was even more brutal than the first. The Anglo-French forces stormed Canton. They captured the viceroy, Yi Mingchen, and shipped him off to Calcutta, where he died in exile. They pushed north, aiming for the heart of the empire, Beijing. As we approach the climax of this tragedy, we must visualize the march on Beijing in 1860. The emperor had fled to his summer retreat in Rihei. The capital was left defenseless. The British and French troops arrived at the northwest suburbs of Beijing, home to the Yuanming Yuan, the old summer palace. This was not a single building, but a vast complex of gardens, lakes, pavilions, and palaces, a wonderland of art and architecture collected over centuries. It was the private residence of the emperors, filled with the finest porcelain, gold, ancient manuscripts, and jade. The soldiers looted it. For days, French and British troops ran wild, smashing what they could not carry, draping themselves in silk robes, filling their pockets with jewels. But the looting was not the end. Lord Elgin, the British High Commissioner, wanted to leave a mark that would never be forgotten, a punishment for the mistreatment of British prisoners. He ordered the entire complex to be burned. It took 3,500 soldiers 3 days to burn the summer palace. The smoke was so thick it eclipsed the sun over Beijing. The ash fell like black snow on the terrified city. The architectural wonder of the world, the Versailles of the East, was reduced to charred ruins. The psychological wound inflicted by this act is impossible to overstate. It was a cultural decapitation. What happened next would shape the modern world. The Convention of Peking was signed. The opium trade was finally explicitly legalized. The interior of China was opened to Christian missionaries. The Kowloon Peninsula was added to the colony of Hong Kong. The Qing dynasty survived for another 50 years, but it was a walking ghost. The century of humiliation had begun. The opium pipe became the symbol of the sick man of Asia. As we approach the modern age, the legacy of these wars transformed. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw China struggle to cast off the chains of addiction. It became a central pillar of Chinese nationalism. When the Communist Party came to power in 1949, one of their first and most ruthless campaigns was the total eradication of opium. Dealers were executed. Addicts were forced into rehabilitation. Within a few years, they had largely succeeded where the emperors had failed. But the story did not end there. The center of the opium trade merely shifted. It moved to the Golden Triangle of Southeast Asia, fueled by the chaos of the Cold War. Today, we still grapple with the legacy of the Opium Wars, though often in ways we do not recognize. The skyline of Hong Kong, with its gleaming towers of finance, is a direct result of that rocky island seated in 1842. The handover of Hong Kong back to China in 1997 was viewed in Beijing not just as a territorial reclamation, but as the closing of a circle, the final healing of the wound opened by the British gunboats. In the West, the Opium Wars are often a footnote, a forgotten chapter of colonial adventure. But in the East, they are the primary text. They are the lens through which modern history is viewed, a lesson on the dangers of weakness, the necessity of military strength, and the ruthlessness of international powers. Even the modern opioid crisis in the West carries a strange, dark historical irony. In the 19th century, Western corporations pushed addictive opioids onto China for profit. In the 21st century, the flow of synthetic opioids has reversed, crossing oceans in small parcels, a ghostly echo of the mango wood chests of the past. The poppy fields of the Neolithic era are gone, replaced by laboratories and shipping containers, but the human dynamic remains unchanged. The desire for escape, the greed of the merchant, the fragility of the state. As the fires of the Summer Palace smolder in our collective memory, and the waters of the Pearl River continue their endless flow to the sea, we are left with the silence of history. The empires rise and fall. The maps are redrawn. But the smoke lingers. And now, as the night deepens around you, let the weight of this history settle. The ships have all sailed. The cannons are rusted and silent. The palaces are dust. There is only the quiet of the present moment, drifting, fading into the dark.